Today we're going to be taking a look at creating the 555 and all of the inputs for the various terminals that are going out to the various parts of the model. This lovely piece of copper board will basically be the heart, soul, body and, well, everything when it comes to the electronics within the Voyager model. Let's take a look. This sort of copper board is great stuff for laying out compact systems, especially when you're going to have lots and lots of shared rails, and it'll keep all the components nice and tidy inside the model. So the first step, now that we know that all our circuitry works and what have you on our breadboard, is to figure out how many terminals and pins we need, which is what I've done over here. I've got my positive and negative main rails, and how they need to branch out to the various inputs, and of course for the 555 itself. Now that I've got all that information, we can see that I need 5 inputs for the 12 volt return, 7 inputs for the 555 timer negative return, and for the positive I essentially need the opposite going out in the positive direction, going off to the tuner cells, deflector, engineering hull, and saucer 555 and off directly to the 555 resistors, and only 4 back from the negative, as a lot of the negative is channeled either back directly through the 12 volt, through the 5.5 or through 2 of the 5.5's capacitors. And now that I know that, I can use the board and some markers, and I can lay out a nice, tidy, efficient layout, which should hopefully mean that we can fit this securely within the engineering hull, where the wires are coming up. Let's probably fix it somewhere around here-ish. And with that in place, it'll just handle everything and we won't have to worry about individual components or bits soldered together randomly. So let's start marking it out. So here we have the underside of the board, and of course we're not going to need this whole huge slab of a slab. More likely we're going to end up using a cross section with the 555 timer going vertically across here, and we'll just cut a slit in the copper board so that obviously there's no interference or shorting of any form. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my red marker and I'm just going to mark an input. We'll go, actually I'll use this orientation of the board, keep those screw holes in case I want it for a different project. So I'll mark this outlier as a positive, and that will be my main positive input. And along this rail I need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So I'll just count out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah. Then I have lots of negative rails, so I'm going to put my negative at the bottom beneath the whole circuit. So the next thing that will come is the 555. Now, taking a look at my breadboarded 555 circuit, there's no real reason why the 555 can't be immediately beneath the positive rows, as there'll be plenty of space along the side for all of the resistors and capacitors to be placed. I'm not too worried about space, as it's not really at that much of a premium here, but I may as well still keep it compact if I can. As my board is effectively 8 pins wide now, I'm going to go ahead, just using this grey marker I have, and I'm just going to mark out the board width as 8. If I feel it needs to be bigger, I can always come back. Can't really see that. I can always come back and change that later. As I can't actually see the grey on the board, I'll just use purple for it. That should be. There we are. The purple line should be the edge of our board, and we'll cut it along that 9th pin. To mark it out a 555, I'll use this orange marker. We're going to have it centralized. It looks like I'll need 2 pins on the left on the second, which works very nicely here. So I'm going to mark in my 555 as being these 8 here. That's my 555, and of course, to prevent any shorting, I'm going to need to put a break in the copper board here, which I'll just mark in with a black pen. We need to put in our 2 capacitors and 2 resistors. The 555 timer on the right hand side only needs that single pin, so I'm going to add a break in the board there. So that we can get our spacing right, it's important to remember that our components have certain widths. For example, a resistor will require a length of 5, whereas a capacitor, such as one of these ceramic capacitors, will only need a length of 3. Same for if there were any LEDs on the circuit board, they'd only need 3 as well, depending on their size. So with that in mind, we can take the orange marker and mark in the resistor here, which will come down 5 pins, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which is practically the entire length of the board we've laid out so far. So that's R1. Then after that there will be an entry for pin 7 from the 555. Then we need our second resistor. Yeah. And then we have a polarized capacitor. I apologize if you can hear that. Which will require a footprint of 3. And so 1, 2, 3. If I wanted to, I could lay the resistor and capacitor along the rail and slice it, but as space isn't that much of a premium, I'd rather have a slightly bigger board so that it's not as fiddly. The last thing I need to lay out here is the capacitor coming off pin 5. That can jump immediately down here, and as there's nothing else along that rail, that will be able to jump straight to the negative. Which means now we can mark out the final pieces of our circuit board, which are these negative outputs. I actually noticed I made a mistake in my diagram, because what I didn't take into account is that these pins will be accepting an input, but I forgot to actually put an output in, which would actually be an additional pin, which means that I'll need a full 7 for the 555. But that's fine. This is exactly why we're marking it down rather than trying to do it directly. As you can see, these pro markers won't wipe off like that. But because I know I need the full 7 along the for the 555, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, we can use this pin, so this row for the 555 negatives. As we now need 6 for the 12 volt, we can use the one directly above it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then for our master output, which will require 5, not 4, we can simply use these 5 at the bottom, with the master output being this side pin here. And that is the extent of our PCB. Just the entire little corner of this board just here, with our master input up here and our master output down there. Now that we've got all that marked out, we can cut the board and add the necessary circuit breaks. Alright, to cut the copper board nicely, we're just going to need to grab a workhorse scalpel, then with a metal ruler, let's do the vertical first, and all you want to do is get it lined up and then cut down along the board to the bottom, cut it again at a slightly different angle, and again at a slightly different angle, That should give the board a pretty decent beginning. I'm not going to brick it just yet. So now I've marked that in, I'm going to do this direction, and this time, because it doesn't have the copper to go through, I can just go ahead and just try and cut straight through. Right, let's see how we're doing. And now all I have to do is apply a little bit of pressure, and you can see the board has just come away. And if I do the same thing along here, just a little bit of pressure, pulling it up into that groove we made, and off it snaps. We haven't done too much damage to the full board, so I've still got this huge piece of copper board I can use for the Reliant and Battlestar models. So I'm going to put that back in my electronics box. And we're just left with this wonderful little piece of PCB that I can just use my scalpel and just tidy up to my heart's content. Now that we have our piece of PCB, we now need to ensure that all of our line breaks do not conduct, otherwise we'll short the circuit out. So I've got my multimeter here set to beep, and well, you probably don't need me to tell you, but if I touch these across this break and it makes a beepy noise, I need to break that circuit some more. So, again, with the scalpel and the ruler, we'll find our first break, which is across the 555 timer, and just carefully, not using too much pressure, because we're not trying to cut the board, we're just trying to break the copper. I think 1, 2, 3. So I want to be careful not to skip down into anywhere else. Alright, that looks pretty good. Let's give that a test. Went a little bit deep, but as you can see I've barely scratched the copper there. And as you can hear, there is no issue with connectivity along there. So that just separates out the various components on our board from each other and should prevent any shorting. But that'll have to do it for today. We managed to get everything we need to the point where we can now just solder it all together, so we'll tackle that in the next video. But for now, I'm Raven, and that's all from the desk.